Thank you so much. Okay. So, question. Oh, okay. We have several questions in the notes document. I'll drop that link again. Okay. So, I'll start with the first one. In my experience, advocating for open collaboration on platforms like GitHub often fails as people consider the learning investment into the platform or Git itself as insurmountable. I observed this even in domains like computer science that should be a fit for version control. What are your pitches in the face of such arguments?
If I understand the question correctly, the question is saying that when teaching subjects where you want the learners to use Git and GitHub, then Git and GitHub becomes a lot of friction to get started. Okay. In the courses that I have developed for novices, Git and GitHub is only used in the development of the materials and is intended to be used by any other instructors that participate in the development of the materials. It is not intended to be used by the learners at all. The learners will consume the material either, it could be a Jupyter book or just MP Viewer or creating, in my case, I created learning sequences inside the learning management system, the open platform, OpenEdX. I created learning sequences where literally the students are reading through like an open textbook, the materials that we wrote in Jupyter notebooks. And we, in fact, developed a little project there to provide a plugin for OpenEdX to pull material from a Jupyter notebook that is available in the open, say on GitHub, just by using the URL to that notebook, so that we can display the material inside the course. In the graduate course, the Practical Numerical Methods course, in the graduate course, we did use Git and GitHub, and we did provide support for using Git and GitHub, but that was not the first thing that we present to students, but that was after students have gained a little bit of traction and become interested in the material. And you want to get students, and I agree with this idea, you want to get students immediately working. And Arturo said this as well, you want to get students immediately experiencing the satisfaction of having achieved something rather than putting things that create friction. And that also applies with installation friction. I think Arturo was probably referring to that, installation friction, right? You want to use Binder, people just click one button and they can start typing right away and following along to your lesson. Having students in the first class downloading Anaconda and having to install their and getting all their Python, conflicts solved is a sure way to lose them in class number one. So I agree with your experience that GitHub or Git can be a struggle. Now, if you meant that this was also a barrier for contributions, other instructors contributing to the material, then I don't know what to say about that. I guess you can't receive contributions from people who can't use the tools that we have adopted for building open source projects. I believe we have critical mass of people in the technical subjects using computation that do know how to use these tools to maintain healthy communities, though.
Yeah, I definitely, so I appreciate both of those pieces, right? The student side and the instructor side. But I read this question as, what about people who are less Git fluent and might prefer to have static materials? Because I think, as you sort of talked about, I really liked that framing you had about author-centered for open education resources. Like it's a lot less scary to have something that's up and static that people can't make edits or comments to. So yeah, I certainly, it's a different shift.
But the open source ethos is we want to cultivate users as contributors, right? And that requires community building. And that is what I want to bring our attention to, that we can adopt in teaching, especially subjects like machine learning and AI that are developing so quickly. We want to, these materials are going to be constantly evolving. So we want to create communities around courses that we teach, and we because it's a huge effort to develop a course on these materials. And the Scikit-Learn MOOC, they did it through a team, and they have the aspirations of inviting contributions. Then that's the model we want to use, because otherwise this huge effort, it's just impossible for a small team, and it becomes out of date very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I really, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As somebody who maintains their own course on GitHub, yes, I agree. I'm going to read somebody else's comment from the Hedgehog document. So this is a comment: engaging in an open source teaching project requires time. Most of this time is invested in establishing the routines and rituals of the project. In my experience, this puts people off even more so than using the Git technology. So this idea, I think, of building a new class is a tremendous amount of effort, certainly. So that's just a comment from the document. So another question, on the problem of reuse of OER, isn't that mostly a problem of visibility? To my knowledge, we rarely publish references publicly when delivering lectures. And even so, would Google Scholar or similar services pick this up? At least I struggled with this when trying to cite Sebastian Roschke's work in a course of ours. And I'm also gonna just copy the questions into the chat for those who'd rather read them there and on the Hedgehog document.
I would argue that is not mostly a problem of visibility. If the materials, there's open educational resources like that have been created to replace standard textbooks in introductory courses in university, general chemistry or general psychology or calculus 1 or econ 101. And many professors, well, yes, there's some awareness, not being aware of those materials. It's a factor, but many professors are still assigning commercial textbooks. It could be these commercial textbooks have a huge marketing effort to push those commercial expensive textbooks. It could be that these have additional teaching aids like problems and homeworks and slides and things that make the life of the professor easier. But if we had communities of teachers developing materials for these commonly used topics, we could have pools of those types of supplementary learning objects as well. But there's a very big factor that has to do with when you're teaching for the first time a course, you kind of have to experience the process as a would-be learner while you're preparing that course, and at the end you end up developing your own teaching materials, or there's this sense that, well, they didn't frame it the way I would teach it, and so I don't want to adopt this book because chapters 1 through 7, I would teach them in a completely different order. That's where the idea of design comes in. This modular design, instead of doing one, a monolithic textbook, 400 pages, breaking things down into modules that would be taught in 2 weeks' time in a course, and then sharing those individually, and then sharing experience reports of how a course was built using these different modules so that other people can adopt parts of it, are ways that we control that complexity and facilitate reuse and adoption.
I think we have a follow-up from Peter, so I'm gonna.
Yeah, I totally buy into that argument, Lorena, but I honestly speaking, this is a reward that comes in way down the road, you know. And I think this is one of the main challenges that I personally see for pushing material out there, because the reward that comes in through the community. So you get to meet people like we are meeting here, and then there's feedback, both positive and negative, or let's say hopefully constructive, that brings forward the entire community. But there's always friction, right? Let's be honest with this. In my personal experience, and this doesn't need to be a bad thing, right? I mean, conflict is just a part of human life. The question is how you deal with it and how it helps or doesn't help the project at hand. So what I'm often observing, like what I know from the carpentries, for example, is that people all follow, well, or not follow, but buy in a similar goal, right? So they want to do something, they want to improve teaching material, etc., etc. However, if I then venture out into the our local university, that is, the majority of people don't have a goal. For them, it's a duty, right? And already that differentiation really can, you know, tip the balance. That people rather say, okay, it's my duty, so fair enough. So I'll keep everything to myself, and that's it. Whereas people that are highly motivated, even being it a very idealistic or sometimes even dogmatic motivation, they really put or are happy to invest something in this, so that the reward is really only coming down the road rather than immediately, you know?
I guess you're touching into the misaligned incentives and reward system of academia. And that is a problem that we face in research as well, because good practices in data management and reproducibility are not rewarded like we would like to. Projects like JAWS and Jose are born out of that misalignment to provide at least the ability to get publication credit out of those efforts. And that can be early on. As soon as you have a finished product, it has the side benefit that some people will review that product and improve the quality, ideally, of it by giving you suggestions, but you will get a publication that reflects that effort, and that can go in your CV, and it's captured by Google Scholar. Now we need to learn to cite those publications so that they also just enter into the currency of reward that we have in academia. But over time, we do want to change that culture. We do want to make teaching part of our scholarly endeavor by rewarding innovation, rewarding original creation of original content and collaboration. And this is ever more important in subjects like machine learning and AI, where the pace of change, the pace of technology is so fast, and universities are just falling behind. We really cannot wait the 5 years that it takes to approve, new courses through whatever approval some universities have to get, a machine learning course for engineers, a machine learning course for physicists, and so on. So we need communities to come together and push, because any single person probably will not be able to exert the pressure necessary for those changes to happen.
Thank you so much. I also resonate with this question about and a theme for your talk about linking and building community, linking to the resources, linking out to documentation, because I often feel like the odd one out, where my students at the bottom of their Jupyter labs get sometimes 15 references of where I linked to stuff or where I discovered stuff. So but that's not as common. And so it's nice through your talk. I've now developed, or I've seen some language that I can use when describing my courses. It's not just, oh, here's a bunch of links, but this feeds into this idea of community building. And I love this focus on the community, because one thing we talk about in active learning is shifting, right, from an instructor-centered approach, right? Lecturing feels good to me. I know I covered the material, and it's a lot scarier to transfer to your students, right? To their learning community. And so I love this sort of meta idea of transferring from, you know, the singular instructor to the community of instructors to kind of help hone and build. So that was just a comment. I just love that. I'm going to read the last question. In the classroom, I observed that many instructors and teachers being reluctant to use OERs. When I approach them and share that they share that they feel it would remove autonomy from their role as a teacher from them. In other words, when you were using material from someone else, they feel their expertise did not play a role anymore. What advice would you give them, or advice would you give someone who does use OERs to sort of help someone make that transition to OERs?
Yeah. So that really reflects that point that OER have not been transformative, despite more than 20 years of huge amounts of OERs being created and huge amounts of investment in things like OpenCourseWare, MIT. And yes, students all over the world use the MIT OpenCourseWare to study subjects that they are interested in, but they do not get adopted by other instructors that want to teach similar courses for many reasons. But one that you mentioned is, you know, somebody else wrote that, they put it out there. They're not inviting me to contribute. They're not fomenting a culture of user as contributor at all. And I just have to take whatever they said, MIT professor, and just use it without modification. So that's what happened with OER. That author-centered model discourages owning or, you know, modifying, remixing the materials. And it's not the fault of that person, but the design of OERs up to this point has been monolithic and not really included reuse as a feature from the get-go. So it is a hard sell, and I don't have an answer for this question, because if you want to advocate for using OER as they are right now, the challenges and the friction is there, and someone has to be really motivated to do it. You can do so at an institutional level when a group of instructors perhaps collaborate with the library or the librarians at the institution to address particular courses. I don't know, general chemistry, okay? You can have a movement to change just one course at your institution through a coordinated effort, but it does require kind of like a political savvy rather than just technology. So this is the key question. OER have not been transformative. Why? Because they missed the key feature of free and open source software communities, which is developing it in the open, cultivating our communities of users as contributors. That is the key message, that we change that and we make OER easier to adopt.
I don't know if you can see Peter cheering silently. Lots of thumbs up, hands in the air. So yes.
I see his reactions, yes.
Are there other questions from the audience? You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or post a question either in the chat or in the hedge document. It's not a hedgehog document, it has a hedgehog, but I think one takeaway I'm taking from your discussion, from your talk, is almost that the phrase open educational resources is misleading. Because of the rise of open source, I think people conflate those two things and think, oh, if I publish something, you know, like a YouTube video or some Jupyter notebooks, it is therefore open source. And to me, that just, it feels like very similar to these conversations that are happening in other pedagogical spaces about active learning versus passive learning. But just sort of, I find that like almost the phrase open educational resources is misleading. It's sort of like maybe public educational resources or something, and I had never thought about, again, because until about 45 minutes ago, I too was conflating these things. of like, oh yeah, slides are static. There's no way to put an easy GitHub issue, right? There's no invitation for collaboration. Not even, it could be, critique, it could be improvement, but this idea of, I'm really feeling this tension between this word open educational resources that feels open sourcey, but it really isn't. It can be, but it really isn't. Yeah. I don't know if that's a good if that's a good tweet to take home, but that's the tweet that's bouncing around in my brain.
There's degrees of openness. So we do have to admit that. So putting something out there with a CC BY license, yes, it's good. It's a first step, but it's more advanced, more developed, and more transformational if we design something to be reused from the get-go, and if we are inviting others to not only reuse but to remix and contribute back. Those are just levels of maturity, or I'm trying to remember the word they use for, like, enlightenment, enlightenment.
Yeah. Right. And just sort of as you're saying, right, these levels of openness, it's the same thing when we're thinking about, a lot of other axes that people are thinking about in terms of grading practices, right? There's a whole set of nuance between traditional ports-based grading all the way to ungrading, right? You have sort of standards-based grading and contract grading, right? There's a whole range of nuance. And so I think that's a really important point about that openness, right? There's something from just saved on your personal hard drive all the way up to fully open source and sort of matching that. Well, I'm not seeing other questions, but please join me again in thanking Lorena Barba for a fantastic talk. And for all of you for being here, thank you so much. We hope we'll see you next week, either in 3D or in 2D with me. Please check out our website for more details. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to the organizers. You can find us on Twitter. You have our emails. And thank you so much for a wonderful session.